Hello again. It is Mike Bevel. This is my footnotes to George Eliot's novel, Middlemarch. We've not made it very far. We are only on chapter 2. So we have a long way to go, but we're going to get there. Chapter 2 has some dialogue, and I just want to remind people, if anyone is watching this, that I don't do accents. I'm going to do accents. I'm going to try not to because I think it's Smurfy, but I don't see it happening. But it's going to happen. And we're both going to be embarrassed, like I said last time. But I mean, love me in my embarrassment and love yourself in your embarrassment. We're just got a lot of love. I had a friend in high school, and she and I lived in Klamath Falls, Oregon. Her name was Hope. And she and I there was a trolley, like a historic trolley that would travel around the downtown Klamath Falls area during the summer. And she and I would just, because it was free, and we would just jump on and ride around it all day because we were super cool. We kissed a lot of boys. And she and I pretended to be English foreign exchange students. We talked about jumpers and boots and crisps and biscuits because we thought, let's make it authentic. Specificity is really, it's important for comedy to be on the nose. Anyway, chapter 2 opens with a quotation from Don Quixote by Miguel Cervantes. I will not be reading the Spanish version because I will be committing a variety of hate crimes in my pronunciation of Spanish words. I should know better. It doesn't speak well of me that I don't know Spanish at all. I know enough. Zach and I went to Spain, which I don't recommend unless you love Spain. I mean, if you love Spain, then go and the soft animal of your body and all that. But I'm not a Mediterranean climate person, except I do want to go hold some sloths, and that's not a Mediterranean climate. That's more of a rainforest climate. I'm going to be gross and sweaty and sticky, but I'm going to be holding a sloth. Here's the quote, chapter 2. Seest thou, take 2, remember, no editing. Seest thou not yon cavalier who cometh toward us on a dapple gray steed and weareth a golden helmet? What I see, answered Sancho, is nothing but a man on a gray ass like my own who carries something shiny on his head. Just so, said Don Quixote, and that resplendent object is the helmet of Mambrino. So let's read this chapter again. I've read part of, but not all of. Puzzle people cannot laugh. Don Quixote. And so I don't entirely understand how this fits in with this chapter. Maybe we'll talk about it at the end. So put a pin in Don Quixote. Let's hope I remember. I probably won't. Sir Humphrey Davy, said Mr. Brooke, over the soup in his easy, smiling way, taking up Sir James Chatham's remark that he was studying Davy's agricultural chemistry. Well, now, Sir Humphrey Davy, I dined with him years ago at Cartwright's, and Wordsworth was there too. The poet Wordsworth, you know. Now, there was something singular. I was at Cambridge when Wordsworth was there, and I never met him. And I dined with him 20 years afterwards at Cartwright's. There's an oddity in things now. But Davy was there. He was a poet too, or, as I may say, Wordsworth was poet 1, and Davy was poet 2. That was true in every sense, you know. And I love that Mr. Brooke is a name dropper. Just so delightful. Dorothea felt a little more, well, wait a minute, let's talk a little bit about agricultural chemistry. So England is trying to, at this point, the Industrial Revolution is happening. And there's also an agricultural revolution happening. Like, how can we get more crops to feed more people? Because it turns out there's a lot of fucking in England, and there are a lot of people who want to eat food. and there's food scarcity. We're going to have some potato famines later on in Ireland, caused by the English, and anyway, we'll just keep that for yourself. Dorothea felt a little more uneasy than usual. In the beginning of dinner, the party being small and the room still, these motes from the masses of magistrates' minds fell too noticeably. She wondered how a man like Mr. Casaubon would support such triviality. His manners, she thought, were very dignified. The set of his iron gray hair and his deep eye socket made him resemble the portrait of Locke, should be John Locke, the philosopher. He had the spare form and the pale complexion which became a student as different as possible from the blooming Englishman of the red-whiskered type represented by Sir James Chettam. So something that Eliot is setting up for us right now is sort of two different styles of masculinity. You've got Sir James Chettam, who is sort of a man's man and likes sport and pleasure and beauty. And you have Casaubon, who is intellectual and internal. So Chettam, all external, Casaubon, mostly internal. I am reading the agricultural chemistry, said this excellent baronet, let me try that again. I am reading the agricultural chemistry, said this excellent baronet, because I'm going to take one of the farms into my own hands and see if something cannot be done in setting a good pattern of farming among my tenants. Do you approve of that, Miss Brooke? Let's stop there for a second to talk about James Chettam and sort of talk about this toxic but also sort of benign care that the wealthy show to the poor. So what the poor are doing, they're planting gardens, and they also have wisdom that would be handed down orally, traditionally, from family to family, and then that would be continued within a community. So a community might be well known for, medicine, or might be well known for gardens and herbs and vegetables and all of that. And James Chettam is going to try to fix this with science. And that's a question, I think, or that's something that Eliot is interested in exploring, is what use is science? I can't find any use for it. They say in space is a vacuum and no one can hear you scream. Well, what are you doing in space screaming? Like, that doesn't make any sense. And I don't care that if you drop a feather and a penny in a vacuum tube seal, they both fall at the same rate. We don't live in a vacuum tube seal, so that doesn't help me. I'm also not interested in planets. Sorry. Very anti-intellectual, and I'm a Luddite. We should read Shirley by Charlotte Bronte next. Boop. All right. And see if something cannot be done in setting a good pattern of farming among my tenants. Do you approve of that, Miss Brooke? A great mistake, Chettam, interposed Mr. Brooke, going into electrifying your land and that kind of thing. And that's a literal. They applied electricity to the ground to make things grow more. They also applied mercury to syphilis. Just a lot of bad choices. But a game that Zach and I like to play, especially when we used to go on car trips. We don't car trip so much anymore. We're reaching an age where car trips are no bueno. And I said I wasn't going to quote Don Quixote in Spanish. I can't do a long car trip. I drove across country with my brother, and it nearly ended me. Those last 100 miles were the worst 100 miles of my entire life. But they thought they could apply electricity. Oh, so yeah, what Zach and I like to do on road trips sometimes is play a game called What Will Be Ridiculous in 50 Years or 100 years. Things that we believe now that in 100 years we would look back on and say, oh my God, those people thought that? Like the way we think curing stuff with arsenic is not a great idea, or not curing stuff, but using arsenic in dyes not a great idea. Using it in makeup, also not a great idea. Like just all the uses for arsenic they found that weren't poison were never a good idea and always turned out to be poison. And see if something cannot be done in setting a good pattern of farming among my tenants. Do you approve of that, Miss Brooke? Great mistake, Chettam, interposed Mr. Brooke. Going into electrifying your land and that kind of thing, and making a parlor of your cowhouse. It won't do. I went into science a great deal myself at one time, but I saw it would not do. It leads to everything, and that's a very true statement. Science leads to everything. A lot of it bad. I'm not anti-science, guys. I'm just anti-vax. I'm not anti-vax. Absolutely not. But I don't get the flu shot, so I think part of me is, and it's okay. I haven't had the flu, but I don't think I didn't get the flu because I didn't get the flu shot. I don't know why I don't get the flu shot. I don't know. It'll come to me. I went into science a great deal myself at one time, but I saw it would not do. It leads to everything. You can let nothing alone. No, no. See that your tenants don't sell their straw and that kind of thing, and give them draining tiles, you know. But your fancy farming will not do. The most expensive sort of whistle you can buy, you may as well keep a pack of hounds. Surely, said Dorothea, it is better to spend money in finding out how men can make the most of the land which supports them all, than in keeping dogs and horses only to gallop over it. It is not a sin to make yourself poor in performing experiments for the good of all. So Dorothea is a utilitarian. She spoke with more energy than is expected of so young a lady, but Sir James had appealed to her. He was accustomed to do so, and she had often thought that she could urge him to many good actions when he was her brother-in-law. Mr. Casaubon turned his eyes very markedly on Dorothea while she was speaking and seemed to observe her newly. Young ladies don't understand political economy, you know, said Mr. Brooke, smiling toward Mr. Casaubon. Well, I remember when we were all reading Adam Smith. Adam Smith is you could call him an economist, or he is an economical philosopher. Adam Smith, he wrote a book about the wealth of nations, and I don't think he coined the term laissez-faire, but he is sort of behind laissez-faire economics, unless I got that all wrong. Money is as useful as planets to me right now. I remember when we were all reading Adam Smith. There is a book. I took in all the new ideas at one time, human perfectibility now. But some say history moves in circles, and that may be very well argued. I have argued it myself. The fact is, human reason may carry you a little too far. Over the hedge, in fact. It carried me a good way at one time, but I say it would not do. I pulled up in time, but not too hard. I've always been in favor of a little theory. We must have thought, else we shall be landed back in the Dark Ages. But talking of books, there is Southey's Peninsular War. I am reading that of a morning. You know Southey. No, said Mr. Casaubon, not keeping pace with Mr. Brooks's impetuous reason, and thinking of the book only. I have little leisure for such literature just now. I've been using up my eyesight on old characters lately. The fact is, I want a reader for my evenings, but I am fastidious in voices. I don't think he would like me reading this book. And I cannot endure listening to an imperfect reader. It is a misfortune in some senses. I feed too much on the inward sources. I live too much with the dead, which is why I think Casaubon is a vampire, or can be looked at as a vampire. What does that mean? So I'm not trying to suggest that he's a literal vampire, but if we look at him through the symbology of vampires and vampirism, he becomes interesting. I think, or it's a way to understand him as a person, and certainly as how he and other people relate. My mind is something like the ghost of an ancient wandering about the world and trying mentally to construct it as it used to be, in spite of ruin and confusing changes. But I find it necessary to use the utmost caution about my eyesight. I believe it was Milton who went blind, and his daughters wrote out his poetry for him, and I think maybe that even comes up. Yeah, what if I just read quietly to myself and that was the video? I won't do that. There was something else I wanted to say too. Oh, there's this idea that I run into a lot, especially in conservative or fundamentalist Christian groups, that the farther back in time you go, the more unified Christianity becomes, until you can sort of go all the way back to an Christianity, or the Christianity, the Christianity that was corrupted, and that's just not the case. There was almost immediately splintering in the early days of Christianity. Some of it around the divinity of Christ, some of it around the crucifixion, some of it around the resurrection. I mean, just lots of schisms, and the one that we know is the one that won. So we don't read the Gnostics unless you're a geek like me, and we don't read other what is it called? AME, Ancient Middle East texts that also record scripture. So anyway, this was the first time that Mr. Casaubon had spoken at any length. He delivered himself with precision, as if he had been called upon to make a public statement, and the balanced sing-song neatness of his speech, occasionally corresponded to by a movement of his head, was the more conspicuous from its contrast with good Mr. Brooke's scrappy slovenliness. Dorothea said to herself that Mr. Casaubon was the most interesting man she had ever seen, not excepting even Monsieur Leray, the Vaudois. I'm not a French person and I don't speak French, so I butchered the merde out of that. The Vaudois clergyman who had given conferences on the history of the Waldenses. Oh, there's a lot going on there. So the Waldensians rejected the authority of the Roman Pope. The Waldensians associated themselves with the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century and were aided by Cromwell. That would be Oliver Cromwell, not Thomas Cromwell, in the 17th century. All right, fair enough. Sometimes you will read an old and timey book like Middlemarch or anything in the 19th century, and you can get discouraged because there will be references that you may not get right away because they are cultural references. And sometimes there are cultural references that can only exist within that culture. Like if you try to take them outside of the culture, they burst like a bubble and they don't make sense. So what I would say to you is allow yourself to be a little confused, pretend maybe that you are at a dinner party and you get some of the conversation, but not all of the conversation. And when you feel like you really need to know something, absolutely look it up, but don't bog yourself down, because a book is telling a story. If you're reading a nonfiction book, those rules go out the window. You should probably understand all of it. But a fiction book, just focus on what the characters are doing and how they're doing it, and how other people react to how they're doing it. Where did we leave off? To reconstruct the past world, doubtless with a view to the highest purposes of truth. Again, this idea that you can go back to a pure form of truth is also very popular in the 19th century and also not correct. To reconstruct a past world, doubtless with a view to the highest purposes of truth. What a work to be in any way present at, to assist in, though only as a lamp holder. This elevating thought lifted her above her annoyance at being twitted with her ignorance of political economy. that never explained science, which was thrust as an extinguisher all over her lights. Hi, I am Dorothea Brooke, because I also do not understand those things. Get really frustrated. Political economy, whatever the fuck that is. But you are fond of riding, Miss Brooke, Sir James presently took an opportunity of saying. I should have thought you would enter a little into the pleasures of hunting. I wish you would let me send over a chestnut horse for you to try. It has been trained for a lady. I saw you on Saturday cantering over the hill on a nag not worthy of you. My groom shall bring Corydon for you every day if you will only mention the time. Thank you, you are very good. I mean to give up riding. I shall not ride any more, said Dorothea, urged to this brusque resolution by a little annoyance that Sir James would be soliciting her attention when she wanted to give it all to Mr. Casaubon. We've been there, haven't we, girls? No, that is too hard, said Sir James in a tone of reproach that showed strong interest. Your sister is given to self-mortification, is she not? He continued, turning to Celia, who sat at his right hand. So Celia's at the table, too. I wonder what her thoughts are about all this. I think she is, said Celia, feeling afraid lest she should say something that would not please her sister, and blushing as prettily as possible about her necklace. She likes giving up. If that were true, Celia, my giving up would be self-indulgence, not self-mortification. But there may be good reasons for choosing not to do what is very agreeable, said Dorothea. Mr. Brooke was speaking at the same time, but it was evident that Mr. Casaubon was observing Dorothea, and she was aware of it. Exactly, said Sir James. You give up from some high, generous motive. No, indeed not exactly. I did not say that of myself, answered Dorothea, reddening. Unlike Celia, she rarely blushed, and only from high delight or anger. At this moment, she felt angry with the perverse Sir James. Why did he not pay attention to Celia and leave her to listen to Mr. Casaubon if that learned man would only talk, instead of allowing himself to be talked to by Mr. Brooke, who was just then informing him that the Reformation either meant something or it did not. Hi, that's me at a lecture. This is either important or it isn't. That he himself was a Protestant to the core, but that Catholicism was a fact, and as to refusing an acre of your ground for a Romanist chapel, all men needed the bridle of religion, which, properly speaking, was the dread of a hereafter. Oh, let's do that one more time. Catholicism was a fact, and as to refusing an acre of your ground for a Romanist chapel, all men needed the bridle of religion, which, properly speaking, was the dread of a hereafter. And we get to that question that comes up in Job, which is, do we do good because we do good? Or do we do good because we don't want to be punished? So doing good to avoid punishment, is that a different kind of good than just doing good for the sake of goodness? So think about that. I made a great study of theology at one time, said Mr. Brooke, as if to explain the insight just manifested. I know something of all the schools. I knew Wilberforce in his best days. Do you know Wilberforce? We know Wilberforce because he was a philanthropist, and he was also one of the main movers to abolish slavery in England. England stopped the slave trade way before America did. America said, great, more for us. And then we did. Do you know Wilberforce? Mr. Casaubon said, no. Well, Wilberforce was perhaps not enough of a thinker, but if I went into Parliament, as I've been asked to do, I should sit on the independent bench, as Wilberforce did, and work at philanthropy. Mr. Casaubon bowed and observed that it was a wide field. Yes, said Mr. Brooke with an easy smile, but I have documents. I began a long while ago to collect documents. They want arranging, but when a question has struck me, I have written to somebody and got an answer. I have documents at my back. But now, how do you arrange your documents? In pigeonholes, partly, said Mr. Casaubon with rather a startled air of effort. A pigeonhole will not do. I have tried pigeonholes, but everything gets mixed in pigeonholes. I never know whether a paper is an A or Z. I wish you would let me sort your papers for you, uncle, said Dorothea. I would letter them all and then make a list of subjects under each letter. Mr. Casaubon gravely smiled approval and said to Mr. Brooke, you have an excellent secretary at hand. You have an excellent secretary at hand, you perceive. No, no, said Mr. Brooke, shaking his head. I cannot let young ladies meddle with my documents. Young ladies are too flighty. Dorothea felt hurt. Let's stop for a moment here because I think that's an important sentence. Dorothea felt hurt. And we kind of sometimes can think that people are inured to the social situations that they are in, but we know that they aren't. So I think women knew that they were being treated as lesser than, and some women acquiesced because it was easy and it made their lives easier, and we don't judge them for it at all because what's the choice? But we also don't necessarily have to look askance at the women who push the boundaries either. I just like that for a moment, Dorothea feels hurt, and George Eliot tells us it's because of sexist comments from her uncle. Dorothea felt hurt. Mr. Casaubon would think that her uncle had some special reason for delivering this opinion, whereas the remark lay in his mind as lightly as the broken wing of an insect among all the other fragments there, and a chance current had set it alighting on her. When the two girls were in the drawing room, Celia said, "How very ugly Mr. Casaubon is." "Celia, he is one of the most distinguished-looking men I ever saw. He is remarkably like the portrait of Locke. He has the same deep eye sockets." And if a lady loves anything, it's deep eye sockets. Had Locke those two white moles with hair on them? Oh, I dare say. When people of a certain sort looked at him, said Dorothea, walking away a little. Mr. Casaubon is so sallow. All the better, I suppose, you admire a man with the complexion of a cochon de lait. Cochon de lait is suckling pig in France. In French. But I don't think I said it correctly. Dodo, exclaimed Celia, looking after her in surprise. I never heard you make such a comparison before. Why should I make it before the occasion came? It is a good comparison. The match is perfect. Miss Brooke was clearly forgetting herself, and Celia thought so. I wonder you show temper, Dorothea. It is so painful in you, Celia, that you will look at human beings as if they were merely animals with a toilette and never see the great soul in a man's face. Remember before when we took a moment to read some Macbeth to each other earlier on about how difficult it is to tell the character from the face, and here it is again. Has Mr. Casaubon a great soul? Celia was not without a touch of naive malice. Yes, I believe he has, said Dorothea with the full voice of decision. Everything I see in him corresponds to his pamphlet on biblical cosmology. He talks very little, said Celia. There is no one for him to talk to. Celia thought privately. Dorothea quite despises Sir James Chettam. I believe she would not accept him. Celia felt that this was a pity. She had never been deceived as to the object of the baronet's interest. Sometimes, indeed, she had reflected that Dodo would perhaps not make a husband happy who had not her way of looking at things, and stifled in the depths of her heart was the feeling that her sister was too religious for family comfort. Notions and scruples were like split needles, making one afraid of treading or sitting down or even eating. When Miss Brooke was at the tea table, Sir James came to sit down by her. not having felt her mode of answering him at all offensive. Yeah, because when has a man ever noticed a woman's disinterest, and not disinterest, her sense of uninterest? Um, why should he? He thought it probable that Miss Brooke liked him, and manners must be very marked indeed before they cease to be interpreted by preconceptions either confident or distrustful. She was thoroughly charming to him, but of course he theorized a little about his attachment. He was made of excellent human dough and had the rare merit of knowing that his talents, even if he let loose, would not set the smallest stream in the country on fire. Hence he liked the prospect of a wife to whom he could say, "What shall we do about this or that?" who could help her husband out with reasons and would also have the property qualifications for doing so. As to the excessive religiousness alleged against Miss Brooke, she had a very indefinite notion of what it consisted in and thought that it would die out with marriage. Oh, wait, let me read that again. As to the excessive religiousness alleged against Miss Brooke, he had a very indefinite notion of what it consisted in and thought that it would die out with marriage. So George Eliot has another book called Adam Bede. We may have discussed it before. I'm also old and don't have a great memory. But there's a character who, let's see, what did I just read that made me think of that? He had a very indefinite notion of what it consisted in and thought that it would die out with marriage. Right. So the woman is Dinah. She is a Methodist minister because at the time of the novel, women could be preachers, and it was sort of rare for, at a time when it was rare for women to have occupations at all. And this gives Dinah incredible freedom of movement. She's able to travel from town to town because she's doing a job. So it's this freedom. It's this wild sense of freedom. Are those my chimes making that beautiful noise? I hope so. That's what I got them for. Anyway, I think, oh, it's over here. So anyway, her fear about marrying at the end has to do with losing her ability to travel. And then that is taken away from her because the Methodists soon, toward the end of the novel and in that period of time, had started stepping back from allowing women to be ministers and required them to instead only be parishioners or helpful, but not to preach the word of God or not to preach any word of anyone. Why not? A man's mind, what there is of it, has always the advantage of being masculine, as the smallest birch tree is of a higher kind than the most soaring palm, and even his ignorance is of a sounder quality. Sir James might not have originated this estimate, but a kind of providence furnishes the limpest personality with a little gum or starch in the form of tradition. "Let me hope that you will rescind that resolution about the horse, Miss Brooke," said the persevering admirer. "I assure you riding is the most healthy of exercises." "Oh, I'm aware of it," said Dorothy coldly. "I think it would do Celia good if she would take to it. But you are such a perfect horseman." "Excuse me, I have had very little practice and I should be easily thrown." "Well, then that is a reason for more practice. Every lady ought to be a perfect horsewoman that she may accompany her husband. You see how widely we differ, Sir James. I have made up my mind that I ought not to be a perfect horsewoman, and so I should never correspond to your pattern of a lady." Dorothea looked straight before her and spoke with cold brusquerie, very much with the air of a handsome boy, in amusing contrast with the solicitous amiability of her admirer. "Well, I should like to know your reasons for this cruel resolution." It is not possible that you should think horsemanship wrong. It is quite possible that I should think it wrong from me. Oh, why? Said James in a tender tone of, here's a word, in a tender tone of remonstrance. Let's say remonstrance. Again, one of those words, always read, never heard, nobody read to me. You can cry. But I'm reading for you. That makes me a hero. Mr. Casaubon had come up to the table, teacup in hand, and was listening. We must not inquire too curiously into motives, he interposed in his measured way. Miss Brooke knows that they are apt to become feeble in the utterance. The aroma is mixed with the grosser air. We must keep the germinating grain away from the light. Dorothea colored with pleasure and looked up gratefully to the speaker. Here was a man who could understand the higher inward life, and with whom there could be some spiritual communion, nay, who could illuminate principle with the widest knowledge, a man whose learning almost amounted to a proof of whatever he believed. Dorothea's inferences may seem large, but really life could never have gone on at any period but for this liberal allowance of conclusions which has facilitated marriage under the difficulties of civilization. Has anyone ever pinched into its pileous smallness the cobweb of prematrimonial acquaintanceship? Ooh, that's a doozy. Certainly, said good Sir James. Miss Brooke shall not be urged to tell reasons she would rather be silent upon. I am sure her reasons would do her honor. He was not in the least jealous of the interest with which Dorothea had looked up at Mr. Casaubon. It never occurred to him that a girl to whom he was meditating an offer of marriage could care for a dried bookworm toward 50, except, indeed, in a religious sort of way, as for a clergyman of some distinction. However, since Miss Brooke had become engaged in a conversation with Mr. Casaubon about the Vaudois clergy, Sir James betook himself to Celia and talked to her about her sister, spoke of a house in town, and asked whether Miss Brooke disliked London. Away from her sister, Celia talked quite easily, and Sir James said to himself that the second Miss Brooke was certainly very agreeable as well as pretty, though not, as some people pretended, more clever and sensible than the elder sister. He felt that he had chosen the one who was in all respects the superior, and a man naturally likes to look forward to having the best. He would be the very mawworm of bachelors who pretended not to expect it. It's a reference to a play called The Hypocrite. We haven't seen it. I don't think you need to read it to get that. It adds color, it adds shading, but is it necessary? I don't know. And we have reached the end of chapter 3. And we did that, I think we may have even done that quicker than chapter 1. Oh, no, chapter 2. We're about to start chapter 3 next time. Whew. Okay. So far, 4 days in a row. It's not a trend yet. If I could get 10 of these, I would feel like I'm doing good. I love you, whoever you are. Thank you for listening if you did. And this is Mike Bevel. These are my footnotes to Middlemarch, and I will see you next time. And then we do the awkward part where I keep eye contact and try to stop the recording.